So next, let's hear from Greg, who is going to talk about how he'll take his social network and build a payment system on it.
Great. Hey everybody, thanks again for coming. The food was great. Had a bit. Let me just make sure this thing works. Oops. All right. So as Wallace said, this is my second venture. In 2011, I was sort of into decentralization before it was cool. I wanted to make a decentralized social platform. Felt that Facebook, Twitter, etc. were very centralized, monolithic platforms. And so we set out to make something where an organization, a university, any community could have its own app in the store, its own social network for its members, right? So that they can own their own data and they can maintain their own relationships. So that company, it was my first time around. I raised $250,000 and we went on to make about $1 million in revenue. And this company currently had 5 million people around the world using our software. So we have about going on 6 million people in 110 countries that we reached. Again, the ethos of it was essentially, hey, wouldn't it be great if communities could actually have their own software to run their own social network? Kind of like they use WordPress to have a blog, okay? So around the last few years, I was looking at the crypto space, and my co-founder, he's in the crypto space since 2012. He worked at the Bitcoin Center with Nick Spanos. They really, essentially, he knows everybody in the space. And he was always talking to me about crypto, and he got me. He got me to get interested in it, and we saw similar problems in the crypto space that we saw in the social networking space. That problem is it's not actually being used as money. Currently, show of hands, how many of you have used Bitcoin to pay for a coffee or anything really? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Just curiosity, which store? Oh, anything really? Okay. In the real world.
Coffee shop in the shortest London Tube Station.
Awesome, London Tube Station. Okay, so it's getting a little bit of traction. Here's the thing. Money has 3 functions. One's a store of value, but that one, you could store value in a table. You could store value in real estate, right? So money is not unique. It's not unique to money. Unit of account is kind of interesting, but the big one is that you can pay people, right? It's a means of exchange. And that requires scalability. One of the biggest problems in crypto today is that the biggest platforms, the first movers, Bitcoin and Ethereum, they don't scale very quickly. So what that means essentially is when you have 1 million people in the morning buying coffee, it's kind of hard to do with Bitcoin. So you move it to layer 2 solutions, which is another way of saying we go back to centralized services. There is now a new breed of protocols that tries to get around this, and we're one of them. So the reason that it's slow is because the older protocols need global consensus. Proof of work or stake chooses one computer or a few computers, and they have to validate all transactions in the world, okay? So we said, what if we could do better? First of all, what happens is now that Bitcoin is not used anymore for payments as much, at least VCs like Fred Wilson said it's a store of value. Stripe ended Bitcoin support, saying that essentially it's more suited to be an asset. So who's going to actually handle the payments? Today, payments are handled by Venmo, PayPal, Stripe, the rest. But there's actually a new kid in town, and this is a story not a lot of people are talking about, and that is that social networks are adding a payment layer. Okay, and we have a social network, which made sense. Okay, now why don't we add a payment layer? So Gmail added it back in 2013. Obviously, they're much bigger than we are. WeChat is the big success story because not only can you pay peer-to-peer, like you could do with Gmail or Facebook Messenger, but you can actually pay your barber. You can actually pay your restaurant. There's 1 million merchants more now in China accepting WeChat. That's the future. But that future is centralized, okay? So even though they are disrupting banks and credit card processors for payments, they are centralized, and that comes with the usual problems, which is essentially they have ultimate control of all the accounts. They can shut you down, right? They can freeze your account, like in Cyprus possibly. They can also hoard all the data. They have this information asymmetry. They know what you purchased, right? And that data is also susceptible to hacks as well. So it's the usual thing. So again, how do we combine the two things? How do we have a decentralized but scalable and fast system? So we have a social network. We spent 7 years decentralizing social networking. Later I can show you a bunch of apps on my phone that we actually release for organizations. And each organization, they pay us. We've had organizations pay us, on average, tens of thousands of dollars each to build them apps. And we asked them, also these apps that we put out, the 5 million people, we asked them, who are you and how do you use it? So you could see 35,000 people after a month, they answer our poll, and they said, I'm a church pastor, I use it to contact my congregation. Or I'm an alumni officer and I message members. So these are community leaders. And so that's the app. We also have the infrastructure. I should mention that if you're making a decentralized project, it's kind of an oxymoron if you own all the servers, okay? But a lot of these projects, which billion-dollar market caps, actually own all the servers. Neo started out with their own servers, they had like 7 servers, and they had a billion-dollar market cap. If you're going to be decentralized, you better have a lot of decentralized architecture, which we do. We have 40,000 computers around the world because we just happened to put in the work in the last 7 years. We were featured in the BBC and Newsweek earlier this year because we tried to mine Monero with the calendar. And you should ask me about that. That was an interesting episode. We took it off, by the way. But that episode showed us that we can actually use these computers as validators. And people won't uninstall the software. We lost 1% of people when we were actually doing proof of work, and this is much, much less taxing on the computer. So we have that app as well. So what is this about? So Intercoin essentially is about launching a payment platform to allow any community to have its own currency. And you might ask, well, why would you want to have your own currency? So first of all, who would want to have its own currency? Any kind of community, even countries like Estonia are launching their own currency. Cities have had their own currency for a while. So for example, you've had the Berkshires have Berkshires. Anybody ever hear of Berkshires? Thank you. Ithaca hours, Green Mountain dollars, there's all this stuff, right? Hours. In England, they have Bristol pounds. Brighton has the city of Brighton has its own currency. So cities, organizations, casinos have their own chips, right? It allows, first of all, for money to circulate within the economy. And if you donate to a project, you'd like to see the money stay in there as opposed to right away leaving, right, and going somewhere else. So just to kind of run through this, and then I think we could talk more about the economics or sociology of this later, is that here's what people use it for. People use Intercoin to power community-wide applications. You spoke about smart contracts. This is the next generation. Imagine a community running an app for governance of the community. Then they can actually talk about giving payments. You could donate to a college and have that college pay the students continuously, automatically. You can see how the students are spending the money instead of having to guess. You can donate to a child, let's say in Haiti, okay, and see how that child, not just get the letter from the child, but see how children in aggregate are spending money. What are they spending the money on? And have that money stay in the community. So donation and fundraising is a very important application of this. The vision is very simple, and I'll talk about this a bit later to give time for everybody else. Just wanted to say that the vision in 5 years from now is, look, essentially there's 1 billion Intercoin tokens. It's a fixed supply. And then people can start their own currency on top of it. So if they want to inflate their currency supply, they can, without affecting anybody else. And that's important. Everybody should be able to be in control of their own currency. And we provide the liquidity in and out of each currency, so we're sort of a decentralized exchange. And that's it. And that, essentially the investment opportunity is why we're talking right now. We're raising a $20 to $40 million round, 20 million soft cap. And it's a private round. We're a Delaware C Corp. We're regulated. We've met with the SEC actually, and we're working on also registering a publicly registered security token. So if we do that, we'll be able to have liquidity to the public markets. But until then, the liquidity is mostly selling to communities, which is our business model for the next 5-10 years. And that's it.
Thank you, Greg and Ken. We'll discuss a different approach to payment systems. And there are so many innovative projects on payments. It's not going to be a Darwinian conflict. It's a large market, and there's plenty of room for different types of payment concepts. In the same way in the banking industry, there's plenty of market space for a lot of banks. So now we're going to hear a different approach to the payment system that in fact is using the banking system. 3 what I think are cutting edge investment opportunities, each addressing a different component of what is this very dynamic world. And any comments that I have, I'll intersperse with the questions. But let's begin. Questions from the floor. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question for Intercoin. You mentioned that because of decentralization, it's very hard to achieve scalability. You can't have a million people paying each other at the same time. So what's the consensus algorithm? What's the consensus mechanism that you're using? And if you could disclose how many TPS are you
able to achieve?
Take a seat.
All right, yeah. Would you like to repeat the whole thing again with the microphone?
Right.
I'm kidding. I heard you, but yeah, we're good?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for asking that, by the way. I would love to talk about our technology. I come from a technology background, so Wallace said I used to be a musician, and that's true, and then I got into technology when I was a teenager. So I'm really passionate about building correct architectures for this. I don't think that proof of work, or even proof of stake, is a scalable architecture, like I said, because it has to find a miner. And sometimes if you don't know that miner in advance, it has to send the transactions to every potential miner, which is even worse. Our technology is closest to, I would say, hollow chain and made safe. If I had to give you a quick answer, it basically, look up those 2 projects. I'm in touch with the guys at Made Safe. We could talk offline, but essentially the network is sharded and partitioned, and each token is actually watched over by a small number of computers. The more the token's worth, the more computers watch that token. If it's a 5-cent token, you could double spend that sometimes with a small probability. If it's $1 million token, you want the probability to be really low. So the difference is you don't want global consensus. You don't need every computer to watch every token. So that's essentially what we do. And number of transactions per second, the answer is simply like this. I know it sounds crazy. It's unlimited, because the more computers participate in the network, the more transactions they can do. It's like if I asked you how many people in this room, how many conversations can they have, right? The more people, the more conversations. There's no bottleneck, it's all parallel. Or if I ask how many emails can the internet support, the more computers, the more emails. So that's a proper architecture. If you have to ask how many transactions per second, usually means there's a bottleneck in there somewhere. And we're trying to get rid of any bottleneck that there can be.
Thank you, Greg. Kenny, do you want to comment on security in your system? Do you want to comment?
On that last question?
Yes, in security in Nations Bank.
On security?
Yes.
Nations Bank?
Which is where that question goes. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So security in general is based on,
Gregory, with your company, Intercoin. So, I'm familiar with local currencies. Baltimore had one. And I got the sense that that's kind of what you're doing, but you're doing it on a crypto basis rather than, a dollar. piece of paper. So if you could just go through the steps of like, how would somebody who had an organization, how would you actually have your establish a currency? But before you do that, let me ask you what I'm really getting at is, I guess what I know with the paper currencies, you know, the local currencies, what they're called, that somebody gives them $1 and then they get a piece of paper back, or they give them $5 or something, and then supposedly somebody holds that money, probably hoping that 20% of the money is lost, so it's never redeemed. That's another issue. Could you just go through the steps of how? And I get it. You mentioned inflation. I guess somebody could inflate it, but if they were just being honest, and it was like a one-for-one relationship, what are the steps to do that?
Sure. That's a great question also, because it really goes to the heart of how do these things work, right? So first I'll give you the short answer. The short answer is, look, you go to the intercoin.org website next year, you download the software. That's one way. Huh? You could go to intercoin.org now, but we haven't launched that's what this whole fundraiser is about and why we're raising $20 million. We do have the social networking completely done. That's been working. Organizations already pay us. So we know that they need social networks, okay? They're willing to pay. Then we already asked them, hey, would you like to have your own currency? Like, would you write? And I mentioned a few advantages. I could go on and on about why you would have it. There's many applications. And then you say, how much does it cost? And we say, oh, it's actually completely free for you. Well, how could it be free? Well, when a person goes into a casino, they have the dollars, and they deposit the dollar, and you give them the chips. Same thing when you deposit into PayPal, which is actually like think of it as a casino, because they could freeze your account. I'm kidding. So then you deposit into PayPal, and they essentially issue you PayPal virtual credits, and then you transfer them to someone else, and they cash out. So in most of these systems, there's something on reserve. There's dollars, and on the other side there's euro. And in the banks, they have these Nostro and Vostro accounts that Ripple always talks about, how they eliminate that with one currency. The same way, you have to shift your thinking and say the only thing on reserve in our system is Intercoin. You first have to buy Intercoin at whatever the exchange rate is, and that's transparent and automatic. And then you essentially put Intercoin on reserve. So these communities, they get Intercoin sitting on reserve rather than dollars, euros. And when someone comes to claim the Intercoin, there's a full reserve there. So essentially, each vendor can go and use Intercoin for global payments.
But how do you know that the money will still be there?
Oh, there's a microphone coming.
Okay, one follow-up here, so we get others involved. Go ahead.
If the reserve is Intercoin, okay, and it's not dollars or something, how do you know if you have a social network and you want to have a payment system? How do you know that the money will be there if the person wants the money?
Right. If by the money you mean Intercoin, then that's by design, because Intercoin's on full reserve. It's not a fractional reserve. It must be there. So even if all the vendors cashed out at once, they would all get the Intercoin. Now, I think your question, though, when you think of money, you think of dollars, you think of euros. So that goes into exchange rates, and there's mechanisms that I don't have time to get into here, but you could ask me how we stabilize the coin and peg it to the dollar. So you can start a community. I think that's what you
I think I can give you a very simple answer. Intercoin is the reserve currency. So every one of the local currencies has a 100% reserve. It would be like a gold standard where every issuance of a unit of currency had 100% gold reserve. So the way you've structured it is, curiously, in a classic central banking way for modern currencies, but in a digital world. He's created a reserve currency. It's not fractional. It's a 100% reserve. So you can always redeem in the Intercoin, but then you're running what would be Intercoin currency risk. Namely, what's the value of Intercoin?
Right. And the stablecoin aspects, so we partner with stablecoin projects to take care of a little bit of that risk. And thank you, by the way, that was a great explanation.
No, I can shed a little bit of light on it. So early on, when we were thinking about ways to resolve our problems, there are several mechanisms that are available to take a reserve and then peg it to a currency. They're not necessarily terrific, but they can solve some problems. One, of course, is infusing tokens in or taking tokens out of the reserve as necessary, similar to the Bancorp protocol. You could read up about it unless you're intimately familiar with it already. It's called the Bancorp protocol. Another mechanism that we came up with was actually on a contract-per-contract basis. So, for instance, if we were doing remittance, we would want to have a certain portion of the coin that's part of that particular contract for the remittance. But then we guarantee that during that process, should our coin have volatility go down or go up, we would infuse more coin in or take more coin out of the particular contract at whatever time in the future, up to a 3-day period, that person wanted to get out of the coin. And then we calculate, well, how much volume are we going to have, how much would we have to have on reserve, how many people would be involved at the time. We determined that it was great idea.
I'm going to suggest you take that offline when we break, so we can bring in some great
There's a lot
questions.
more to say, but
No, it's a great question, and it got right to heart of something, but are there other questions in the audience? Or would we, this is a deep theme that could go for a while, and I don't want others not to be able to pose their questions.
I have no problem with monopolizing you guys.
should we continue?
No, but I do.
Should we continue on this topic?
But I do,
They had their
so.
shot.
If there are no more questions.
Any others? Yes, sir.
It's related. It's why would the banks want to participate?
Great question.
Why would the banks?
Banks have,
This is been information pay. I guess
This is nation pay. Why would the banks?
So for debit operations, they certainly want to be able to increase their float. Right now, when you take your money out of the ATM, it's gone from the bank. They can't use it for lending operations. And we have to remember that while so many banks are involved in credit these days, there's still quite a few out there that just are quite happy with their core business, which is lending. And to do that lending with the Frank-Dodd Act, and even before that, it's all dependent on percentages of money that you have to borrow from. You can borrow based on what you have. And if you have that person's dollar in the account, then it's there. Even though it's not their money, they can use it as collateral to borrow and then relend. It's a very important point. And here for debit operations, because of our patent pending process, where you could transfer the promisee and it's still an obligation from the bank to pay, as long as we're KYC and AML compliant, we are. Then they can still use that money. So that's the incentive for the bank to use our system for debit operations. For credit operations, the incentive is drawing in a huge, a much greater merchant base now, because now we can tell the merchant, say, why do you use this payment processor? Why not use Chase Bank? Because Chase has a token and it's a nation pay token, and that means you'll get your money right away, and you should be a Chase merchant. Then now suddenly that merchant will be incentivized to have their own credit accounts with Chase. Remember, Chase is still going to make money on the regular credit fees that they have with the client, but there'll be no merchant fees just for accepting payment. Why should there be a merchant fee just for accepting payment from a client? And in this country, we say, who cares about merchant fees? They're only 2% anyway. But if you go to other countries, you'll see sometimes merchant fees are as high as, and you will not believe this, 25%. You go to Argentina, you're not going to want to use your credit card in any store because it's a 25% credit fee. So that's a major issue.
I'd like to underline what he's saying. It may only be 2 or 2.9%.
Here.
But for the merchants, it's a lot. As somebody who pays those fees, 2% is a lot. It's coming off of your top line.
Imagine if that's 10 or 20% though, just as a point of reference. But so it's. I hope that answers the question.
But also make the point about the central banks, like why the central banks in the
So that's a good question. So as I said, there's a couple of phases here, depending on the relationship that we have with the bank or the country. In the case of a central bank using the currency, the business model is slightly different. I've showed you some more slides that show a little bit about that structure. But when it's the case of the central bank, at the end of the day, the central bank wants to increase their foreign reserve. So if a nation is going to engage us directly, typically it's going to be a smaller nation, not in the top 10 currencies. And they're going to want to increase their foreign reserve in one of the 10 currencies. For the Gambia specifically, it's the euro. So as remittance remittance euros come in, then they are obliged to accept the Dalasi token, not only at the central bank level, but all of their banks. So this way we can even cater to the unbanked as well. again, KYC compliance. We can also have leverage, and we can extend off the bank's own money licenses, MSB licenses as needed. We do plan to use some of the funding. I didn't get to that slide. In our token structure, we're raising $5 million for 2018 and up to $25 million in 2019. The $5 million is 13% of our token, and it's an equity round as well. Some of the fees we generate from our exchange and from the 0.25% transaction fees. By the way, it's 0 transactions fees. It's 0.25% only upon returning monies back to the bank. This encourages tokens to stay in the system. We're really trying to make this, so that the anarchists are like, yes, we love your system. This is ultimately designed to be highly decentralized. We're going to even give NationPay LLC away to our foundation, which we're creating within a 6-year period too. Most of the value will be in the token going up in value through its use, through its volume.
A follow-up question there?
Right, so it sounds like you're describing a decentralized reserve amongst all these banks, but the network itself still lives on, you said EOS or Ethereum. How is that? To me, EOS is 21 nodes is decentralized, but is that really enough?
So I didn't get the first part of the question, but I think you might be asking, like, the degree to which we're decentralized is partly dependent on the platform that we choose to build on,
Right.
correct? Okay.
But the decentralized reserve, I mean, like this value stored in the banks, where that like visibility of the fiat money that I'm storing in the bank, that it's digitally represented in your wallet. I'm the bank, and I get to hold on to it, right? That was what you were saying earlier. So this reserve of all the money backing NationPay's tokens is still just kind of floating around in the banks. So I understand, in a way, maybe it's not a great way of describing it, but it's what's happening, I think. But the network itself, the platform, is that decentralized enough for like this humongous payment system that you have?
So it's interesting, there's a lot to talk about there, but the resolution, the granularity of decentralization is totally a function of how big we are, how many banks are using the system, how many are nations, and how many are independent commercial banks. The beauty of a nation using us is that all the commercial banks in the country are required to use it, but we're doing it in an intelligent way where the banks themselves will have some play in what they can do, and we encourage other people to become banks. So almost anyone can become a bank should they get the correct licenses. It's a bit of a complex question, but I see you nodding, so you like that answer. The other parts of decentralization include the fact that we have an open exchange so that anybody can participate in token-to-token economics, which becomes important as more banks join the system. And then to address like what platform we build on, we cannot control the centralization of the platform. No, we can't control the fact that Ethereum is still the Ethereum Foundation. But then again, if it wasn't for Ethereum's centralization, perhaps they'd be more like Bitcoin, and we could say, oh, sharding's coming out in 3 months. So that's important for us. EOS is great because it really is 0 fees, but they're still in the early stages. If we get funding through EOS, I believe a couple of the gentlemen in this room are directly related to EOS. So that could make a big difference. Development is underway now, but we can change pretty quickly. And part of this $5 million, at least 60% of it is going to go straight into development for the Gambia project. And whether it's built on Ether or EOS is still.
What I like about this channel is the projects are kind of complementary. So next year, if we build Intercoin and you need a platform, we'd be very happy to get to host you guys.
Other questions from the floor? We're moving it around. So, short one.
Long one.
Good questions, but, there's some other things that we have to address.
I don't do it.
Could the two of you talk about how you could make money? Oh, sorry. Could you talk about how you make money with your projects? I mean, if somebody invested, how would you make money?
From an investor perspective or a bank perspective, how would an investor make money on the project?
Well, the company has to make money first.
Sure.
How do you make money?
So the company makes money 2 ways. As I said, there are fees, although they're incredibly small. Our company will take 0.15% fees on monies coming out and going back into the bank. 0.15%.
Ken, how do you make money? And then let's hear it from Dan.
Oh, who said anything about making money? I thought this was about, no. You could, okay, basically, the whole point is there's a fixed supply of Intercoin tokens. And we took sort of a bold step to say, look, you need a full reserve. Okay, this is pretty unusual in the world of banks. Typically there's a fractional reserve. So if you think about it, each community needs to maintain a full reserve to back whatever deposits are in there. And there's a fixed supply of Intercoin. So the more communities essentially buy Intercoin, and we're talking about cities, universities, and possibly even countries, right? That puts upward pressure on the price of Intercoin. So while there may be dividends in the future, we don't know, this token specifically, here's the opportunity. You buy the token now, you let us do our thing, then we actually essentially host ICOs, we host communities for fundraising, for all kinds of things. We develop more and more applications, more and more communities, and essentially we want actual use case for this token. We don't want another speculative token. We want something that's used more and more. The way we think about it is like a startup. You know, if Facebook wasn't used by many people, it wouldn't be worth much, but now that it's used by over 1 billion people, that investment pays off. So that's essentially how you make the money, if it works.
So, Danny, how are you going to make money?
Depends. It totally depends on where we're doing business, how we're doing business, whether it's an SEC license for an exchange that we're talking about, whether it's an MSB license we're talking about. There's different
Okay.
forms of those. There's different flavors of MSB license.
I'm going to do this fast because it's 4. Greg,
I'll keep this very simple. We're a Delaware C corporation. We're under the jurisdiction of the United States. We're currently doing a private offering under Reg D as well as Reg S for non-US investors. And as
who's the regulator of your payments?
Oh, for the payments. So there are several regulators. FINRA, for example, requires you to have a money transmitter license. If you are transmitting, there are exceptions to that, which we're investigating as well. And remember, we're selling to communities, some of which are cities, which have their own exemptions, some of which are accredited investors in their own right if they have $5 million or more in assets. So essentially, we're always trying to stay within US regulations. And of course, we care about foreign regulations as we try to go global in the next couple of years. Well, we're going to have to take care of regulations for these communities. I just want to say one quick thing, which is that it's hard to do a utility token today in this country. I've been outside the country, people here by the United States, they say, oh, how are you going to do a token? It's all securities for now, as far as I know from the SEC. That will change once you peg to the dollar, because if something's pegged, there's no expectation of profit. You're not going to invest in tethers to get a profit. So that's one avenue we're pursuing, and we're looking to get a letter, a no action letter from the SEC. It's just one thing that we want to do.
You have to comply with MiFID requirements, but your servers can be in the United States, or vice versa.
Can I just add one quick thing to this? We've spoken with some of the regulators, okay? The regulators want to work with the entrepreneurs. This is a new and evolving space also. So the regulations you're going to see 3 years from now, it's like a...
We talk about different international, like in blockchain and crypto. We talk about finance. We talk about special banking system. About the crypto.
Yeah, so
What was the question?
Michael,
Say-
sorry, go ahead.
No, the question was about the different entrepreneurship system. This is not
Can you,
like
can't hear you, use this.
No, we talk about special infrastructure for the crypto. We talk about crypto bank. We talk about Binance and different crypto exchanges. We talk about different entrepreneurship, and we talk about crypto funds.
Well, I just, on that point, I'm saying 2 years from now, this is just my view, it's going to look similar to how, for example, the internet allowed user-submitted content. And there were questions, what's the copyright? What's the regulations there, okay? Every new technology, telephony, long-distance calls used to be regulated, were very expensive. Then the internet disrupted that and the cost went to zero. And
how many exchanges in Delaware and how many crypto funds and plus special like the banking system in Delaware?
There would be no exchanges in Delaware.
Yeah, but for example, I'm like a crypto fund, or for example, I want to invest with crypto startups, and for me, it's really important if we talk about infrastructure.
Well, the way it would work within the United States is you incorporate in Delaware, you have Delaware corporate law, and then you register as doing business wherever your business is located, you are subject to two different jurisdictions. On the corporate law side, it will be Delaware. On your operating side, it will be wherever you're located. If you have an international business, doing business in the United States, and I'll use Europe as an illustration, China or Japan, you will then be subject to the local regulators with respect to how you conduct your business in those respective venues. And then there's the concept of the primary regulator, where there is a deference to the primary regulator by the local regulators if the primary regulator is deemed to be from established regulatory environment.
I was going to say the exact same thing.
So when you start to see these massive amounts of institutional money come in global, and what I'm describing is a global issue. So regulation is actually our friend.
Regulation, by the way, 4 years ago, you're talking about the federal government, okay, passed the Jobs Act. And this was actually what enabled a lot, like the general solicitation you see today of some tokens, like, hey, we're selling stuff, is only because of that. So that actually helped. And one of the things that it enabled is something called covered securities, which is it overrides the states having to register with every state. You can still do that, but you don't have to because you're registered with the federal government. So in some ways, regulators are also innovating, and they have to innovate, and they have to work with the industry in order to move things forward.
Good. On that high note, I think it's been a great discussion. I want to thank you all. They're going to hang around, so continue the conversation. I think there's still drinks there.
Yes, there are drinks
So
and food, so
have a few drinks and
finish.
continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank everybody that came out, and Dr. Davis, our professor in the house, has done a very good job of explaining the ins and outs of the industry. Please finish this food, finish these drinks, and get home safely. If you are the designated driver, no more rosé for you for the rest of the day, but there is Coke and Sprites and waters and stuff. Finish that and finish the finish one. Have a good rest of the week and a safe trip if you're going back to the city. Thank you.